They gave me a form to fill out, 17 pages, double-sided, in 3 languages, one of which I did not speak. The third language turned out to be the Vithori administrative dialect, and the treaty office was apologetic about including it. Apparently, every signatory species received the same packet. I filled out the pages I could, left the rest blank, and posted it back to the treaty office in the prepaid envelope they'd included. 3 weeks later, I received a confirmation letter and a small laminated card that said Host Family, Tier 1 in green letters. Card had a clip on the back. I put it in the kitchen drawer with the expired bus passes and the spare key to the old place. My daughter called when she heard. "Opa," she said, "you didn't have to do this." I told her I had nothing else on the calendar. This was true. I had retired from the civil engineering department 18 months prior, 31 years of bridge specifications and drainage surveys, and one very memorable incident involving a contractor who had substituted the proved aggregate with something he described as equivalent. My wife, Latha, had passed 4 years before that. The house we'd lived in together was sold. I was in the colony housing now, a clean 2-bedroom unit on the 14th floor of Block D, with a good southeast-facing window, and a balcony just large enough for a folding chair and a small table. I had my books. I had a routine. I had applied for the host family program because the treaty office had sent a pamphlet with the words, "Share your home and your world, small acts, big connections" on the front, and because I had, at that particular moment, been sitting alone on the balcony with cold tea and nothing much to think about. The program coordinator, a young woman named Thenmosi, called to brief me. "The Vithori," she said, "are a documentation culture. They will send an observer team first, a cultural integration assessment unit, 4 to 6 members, who will spend approximately 2 weeks evaluating the host environment before the actual exchange guest arrives. Think of it as a home inspection, but for cross-species compatibility." I asked how much space they needed. "They can compress," she said, which I found an unusual way to describe house guests. "Will they eat?" I asked. There was a pause. "Their dietary requirements are self-contained. It would be considered a meaningful gesture if you offered." I told her I understood. "Mr. Pillai," she said, and something in her tone suggested she was reading from a supplementary brief. "The Vithori are a high-arousal species. They process environmental safety through what their science calls the Threat Gradient Index. Essentially, they read the stress responses of the beings around them as signals about environmental danger. A calm, unstressed being in a potentially threatening situation reads to them as a warning. Please be aware that your natural demeanor may require some adjustment to appear non-threatening." "My natural demeanor," I repeated. "You may want to appear a little more reactive, animated. It signals to them that you're not an apex predator suppressing visible stress." I thought about this. I was 58 years old. I had spent 31 years reviewing bridge load calculations and attending contractor meetings. I had once sat for 4 hours in a government dispute hearing over a culvert. I was not in any meaningful sense animated. "Keep that in mind," I said. I did not keep it in mind. The assessment team arrived on a Tuesday. It surprised me because I had been told Thursday. There were 12 of them, not 4 to 6, and they came through the door in a cluster that my balcony-facing window had not prepared me for. The Vithori are roughly my height, a little taller on average, with a body plan that is humanoid enough to be recognizable from a distance, and distinctly not human at anything closer. Their skin has no pigment in the conventional sense. It is translucent over a layer of bioluminescent tissue, so that the color they show is produced from within. At rest, they are a soft blue-white. Through emotional activation, I would learn the full spectrum later, they shift through yellow and amber, and at the extreme end, a deep arterial red. The 12 who came through my door were, at first arrival, a cautious pale gold. The lead assessor was a compact individual, with a narrow face, and eyes that were larger than human eyes, set at a slight lateral angle. She introduced herself as Sorrel Vath Karis, Senior Integration Analyst, Vithori Cultural Ministry, 3rd Assessment Division. The name tags they wore were printed in a typeface I couldn't read, but then Mosey had told me the naming convention, and I knew that Karis was the familial name, Sorrel the personal. I had been briefed that Vithori do not shake hands. They touch their own sternum with 2 fingers, and incline their heads slightly. I did the same. Sorrel Vath Karis went very still for a moment, Went to put the kettle on. They spread through the apartment with equipment I cannot fully describe. Handheld devices that emitted a low hum, a larger unit they assembled in the living room that had a tripod base, and a dish-shaped sensor array. 2 individuals who moved slowly along the walls, touching them at intervals with their fingertips, and then consulting a tablet. They were professional and quiet, which I respected. I put out cups on the kitchen counter. I had bought a packet of coconut biscuits from the shop downstairs, because the packet had a pleasant illustration of a palm tree on it, and seemed like the kind of thing one offers to visitors. After 20 minutes, Sorrel Vethkaris appeared in the kitchen doorway. "You are not stressed," she said. Her galactic standard was precise and formal, with a cadence that clipped the ends of words. "No," I said. "The ambient readings in this unit are unusually low." I poured the tea. "Is that a problem?" She looked at me for a moment. Bioluminescence had shifted very slightly from pale gold toward something cooler and more uncertain. A blue-tinged gold, which I would later learn to call deliberative amber. It was the color her species produced when a situation did not fit any available category. "It is a data point," she said carefully. "Will you have tea?" She looked at the cup. She looked at me. "The protocol does not require." "I know," I said. "I'm offering." She took the cup. I did not know it then, but that was the moment the threat classification index began its upward movement. The first 3 days were what I would call a calibration period, though that is my framing. The Vithori's assessment protocol had a formal name, the Initial Environmental Stress Survey, and it was designed, I gathered, to establish a baseline reading for the host individual before the more detailed evaluation began. They were looking for sleep disruption patterns, startle responses, appetite variation, social behavior changes, proximity aversion, and what their documentation called ambient autonomic signaling. In practical terms, this meant that 12 Vithori were living in my 2-bedroom apartment, moving around at irregular hours, occasionally making sounds I had not anticipated, and monitoring whether I reacted. I slept normally. I ate my regular meals. I made tea at 6:15 in the morning, at 11, and at 4 in the afternoon. On the second day, I made a pot of rice and a simple dal, and left serving bowls on the counter with a note that said, "Please help yourself if you like," because there were 12 people, and my kitchen was my kitchen, and I did not know how else to handle the situation. A junior assessor named Tethvel Orith stood in the kitchen doorway for a long time looking at the bowls. "This is your food," he said. "Yes, you are sharing it." "I made enough," I said. He stood there for another moment, then went and wrote something in his tablet. I heard him say something to a colleague in Vethori, which I couldn't follow. But the colleague's bioluminescence went a sharp amber. On the 3rd day they ran what I later understood was their standard arousal probe sequence. This was not announced. At 2:47 in the afternoon, while I was reading in the chair by the balcony window, 3 assessors in the hallway activated what I can only describe as a very loud sound. It was not a sound with musical structure or language content. It was simply loud in the specific frequency range that triggers startle responses in most species with auditory processing. I looked up from my book. I looked down the hallway. I looked back at my book. I would learn later that the average measured startle response for this stimulus, all species tested, was 0.3 to 0.7 seconds of elevated arousal, followed by a recognition phase. My recognition phase apparently had not included the arousal component. The 3 assessors in the hallway looked at each other. Their luminescence had gone a rapid, uncertain yellow-white. I turned a page. In the evening, Sorrel Vethkaris came and stood near the kitchen counter, while I was making the 4 o'clock tea. Late, because I had lost track of time reading. "Missed Eli," she said. "Yes. During the arousal sequence this afternoon, the loud noise." Pause. "Yes. During that event you did not register a response." "I heard it," I said. I looked. Instruments did not detect a sympathetic arousal signature. No cortical spike, no dermal response, no pupillary dilation. Respiration was unchanged. I thought about this while I waited for the kettle. I spent 4 hours last year sitting in a prefab building while a crane operator argued with a site inspector about load distribution. I said. Crane operator had a very large voice. "I think I may have developed a tolerance." She looked at me for a long moment. Color was doing something I hadn't seen before. A slow, deep amber that went all the way to her collar and back, like a tide coming in and going out. "I see," she said. I poured the tea. You are retired, she said. It was not a question. She had the file. Yes. Engineering, civil engineering, bridges primarily, some road work. One very unpleasant drainage system in the Southern District that I would prefer not to discuss. You find this unpleasant to discuss? No, I said. I just don't like thinking about the drainage system. It was a difficult project. The soil conditions were not as represented. Something in a tablet. That night I heard from the room they'd set up as their operations center, what had been the second bedroom, now occupied by equipment and 6 or 7 assessors in shifts. A long, low conversation in Vithori that went on past midnight. My bedroom shares a wall with that room. I was not bothered by it. I had lived for another 3 years in the unit above a family, with 3 children and a small dog. I slept well. The following morning, Tethvel Ora met me in the kitchen, with an expression I had not seen before. He was young, thought. Young by whatever measure the Vethori used, and he had in the 3 days since arrival, been the most consistently curious of the group. He asked questions. Most of the others observed and documented. Tethvel Ora wanted to understand things. Mr. Paley, he said, can I ask you something about your morning routine? Of course. You wake at 5:45. You make tea at 6:15. Between those times, what are you doing? Sitting on the balcony in silence, usually. Not on a communication device? Not reviewing documents? No, just sit, yes. He consulted his tablet. Our monitoring equipment detected no cognitive engagement pattern during that interval, consistent with planning, memory retrieval, problem solving, or emotional processing. The pattern it detected is one our instruments classify as HFY. He paused, checking the term in Galactic Standard, pre-strike suppression. I looked at him. I'm sorry. It is the neurological signature of a predator in the final phase before I'm aware of what pre-strike means, said. I am sitting on my balcony. I am watching the sky. Yes, he said. He looked at me. He looked at his tablet. What are you watching for? Nothing in particular, I said. I like the sky in the morning. It changes. He was quiet for a moment. His bioluminescence had gone a very soft, very cool blue-white. Not alarm, I would learn, but something the Vithori called still uncertainty. The color of a mind that has received a data point it cannot integrate. You watch it because it changes, he said slowly. Yes, because you are monitoring it. Well, I said, and reached for the kettle. I suppose it comes to the same thing. He went and filed a report. I found out later it was 14 pages long. The probe sequences continued through days 4 to 8. I want to be precise about this because I think the variety matters. They were not doing the same thing repeatedly. The Vithori assessment protocol is by design a multivariate series, each element targeting a different arousal pathway. Day 4, but probably sequences. 2 assessors moved steadily closer to me over the course of 20 minutes while I was reading, stopping at intervals to log readings till one of them was close enough that I could see the texture of her bioluminescent tissue clearly. I looked up, registered that she was there, nodded politely, and returned to my page. She stepped back quickly. I heard her exhale in a way that suggested she had been holding her breath for the last several of those 20 minutes. Day 5 was the environmental disruption sequence. Lights cycling rapidly, temperature adjustments, a low-frequency vibration they generated through the floor, with a device I could feel in my chair but not hear. I noticed it. It reminded me of the deep road roller vibrations at infrastructure sites, which I had been standing near periodically for 30 years. I made a mental note to ask then Mosey whether the treaty office would cover any wear on the flooring. Day 6 brought what I believed was intended to be a social pressure sequence. 4 assessors arranged themselves in the living room in what I recognized. Then Mosey had sent me a cultural briefing document as a formal Vethori confrontational stance, squared to me luminescence and elevated to a full assertive gold, postures open and maximally visible. It was, I understood, the Fathi equivalent of a very serious look. I came in from the kitchen, saw them standing there and said, I was going to make tea. Will you have some? 2 of them sat down before the 3rd could stop them. Soral Vethkaris was present for that one. She watched from the doorway. Color had gone, for the first time I had observed, to something approaching red. Not the deep arterial red of full alarm, but a warm amber red that the briefing document described as acute cognitive dissonance. It passed quickly. She wrote in her tablet for a long time. Day 7. I asked her over the evening tea how the assessment was going. She considered her answer for longer than necessary. The data is unusual, she said. Good unusual or bad unusual? We do not typically classify data on that axis, she said, but precedented would be a reasonable characterization. I see. I offered the biscuits. She had, over 7 days, developed a pattern of taking one biscuit, examining it briefly, and then eating it with every appearance of attention. I found this satisfying in a way I could not have explained. Is there anything I can do to make your work easier? She looked at me directly. The Vetherite direct gaze is slightly different from a human one. The lateral eye set means that a fully frontal look involves a deliberate rotation of the head that implies intention. Mr. Pillai, she said, in the 7 days we have been here, you have shown no measurable stress response to any of our standard assessment sequences. You have offered us food on 4 occasions. You slept through a level 3 auditory probe. You watched the sky for 47 minutes this morning without moving. 45, I said. I got up to get my tea. The pre-retrieval stillness period was 45 minutes and 32 seconds. With retrieval, 47. Fair enough. You are, she said carefully, the calmest individual our division has assessed in 11 years of operation. I'm retired, I said. That is not, she said, typically sufficient explanation. I thought about it. I thought about Latha, and the years after, and the long quiet mornings on the balcony of the old house, and then this one. I thought about the particular texture of stillness that settles into a person when the things they were rushing toward have either arrived or passed, and what remains is simply the day in front of you to be moved through at whatever speed seems appropriate. I thought about bridge specifications and drainage surveys and the slow, hard work of making things that hold, and the particular satisfaction of work that asks nothing of you after it is done. I've had a long time to stop being surprised by things, I said. She was quiet for a moment. The threat gradient model, she said, was developed by our Behavioral Sciences Institute 43 years ago. It was validated across 19 species. In all cases, a calm individual in a high-stimulus environment indicates one of 2 conditions: neurological atypicality or active threat suppression. An entity that perceives no threat and therefore shows no arousal would, in our model, not register as calm, because you'd have to notice the stimuli to be calm about them. Yes, and I notice them. Instruments confirm that your sensory processing is entirely typical for your species. So, what does that leave? She looked at me with those large, slightly lateral eyes, and her bioluminescence did the tide-like amber pulse I had come to associate with her, something out in real time. That is, she said slowly, the question our division is currently attempting to answer. I gave her another biscuit. Day 8 brought a wrinkle I had not expected, and which the final report would later classify as an unplanned assessment variable of significant interest. One of the junior assessors, a young female whose name I was still not confident I was pronouncing correctly, though she corrected me patiently each time, had been stationed near the balcony door as part of the day's observation rotation, and at some point during the early morning, she had stepped out onto the balcony itself, presumably to check a sensor reading, and had remained there. I found her there at 6:15 when I came out with my tea. She was standing very still. For a Vethor in an unfamiliar situation, I now understood to mean she was uncertain what to do. Her luminescence was a pale, careful white. The sky was doing its early morning sequence, the particular deep blue that comes just before the light changes, with the first thin line of gold at the edge of the visible horizon. I brought out a second cup and put it on the small table and sat down in my chair. She stood for another moment, then she sat rather carefully on the outer edge of the balcony railing. She could brace her feet against the lower bar, and she looked at the sky. We were there for 38 minutes. She said nothing. I said nothing. At the end, she looked at me and said very quietly, "It is different here than I expected." The sky? The all of it. She gestured at the apartment behind us, meaning the whole situation, I thought. We were briefed that human host environments could be unpredictable, stimulating, that some hosts have difficulty modulating their responses to our presence, and require careful management. That sounds exhausting, I said. Them, yes. She looked at the cup she was holding. You have not required any management. I wasn't aware I was supposed to. You were not. She tilted her head. That is itself an interesting data point. She would sigh to file her notes. The report she submitted, I learned later, 6 pages about the sky, and what it might mean that a human could watch it for 38 minutes without speaking. Her conclusion, on page 5, was that she was unable to reach a conclusion, which she considered an important finding in itself. Sorel Vethkaris had cited it extensively in the main document, annotated with the observation that this was the first time in the division's operational history that an assessor had submitted an inconclusive report about watching a sunrise. Days 9 and 10 were, from my perspective, relatively quiet. The probe sequences had either concluded or moved into a phase 1 I not detect, and the apartment had settled into something approaching a shared rhythm. The assessors worked their shifts. I maintained my routine. I made the doll again on day 9, because the first batch had been well received. And Time Tethvel stood beside me at the stove, and watched every step at the focused attention of someone who is learning something they intend to remember. The red chili, he said. You add it late, not the flakes, the fresh one. You add it when the oil is hot, and the mustard seeds have popped. Why not earlier? Because it burns. He wrote this down. I do not know if Vethor, I have a concept of cooking as a practice rather than fuel delivery. He was treating it with the seriousness of a technical procedure, which I respected. Do you cook? I asked him. Not in the way you mean, he said. Our dietary requirements are managed centrally. We receive allocations. Allocations, I said. Caloric and nutrient packets adjusted for individual physiological profiles. I thought about this. That sounds very efficient, I said, in the tone I had learned over 30 years to use when someone describes a process that is technically functional and humanly terrible. He caught something in it, I think. His luminescence went an uncertain flicker. It is, he said carefully, efficient. A doll takes about 40 minutes, I said, including prep. He watched the pot for a while. 40 minutes seems like a great deal of time for a meal, he said, and his tone had the same quality mine had. Technically accurate, humanly uncertain. It does, I agreed. And then you eat it and it seems like not enough. He thought about this while the oil heated. When the mustard seeds began to pop, he was already watching for them, and he did not startle at the sound. He ate a bowl that evening standing at the kitchen counter the way I sometimes did. Not because there were no seats available, but because the counter was near the window, and the window looked out at the colony lights. I did not comment on it. He ate slowly. Shoo. The way someone does when they are paying attention to what they're tasting, rather than when they intend to finish. Is it thing entirely. And when he was done, he set the bowl in the sink and stood there for another moment looking out the window. In our residential compounds, he said, not quite to me. The light is regulated. It is a consistent value from morning to evening, adjusted slightly for circadian maintenance, the same value every day. This light changes, I said. Yes. He was quiet. Outside, the colony lights had that particular quality they get in the late evening when the residential blocks are all lit at once, and the light pools and mixes at street level, warm in the middle, cooler at the edges with a kind of depth to it that has nothing to do with brightness. It is strange, he said, to find a variable preferable to a constant. Is it strange, I said. He looked at me. His bioluminescence had gone a very soft gold, not deliberative amber, but something quieter than that. Something closer to the white of resolved stillness, but warmer. I did not have a name for that color yet. I found out later the Vethori called it consideration light, which is not a perfect translation, but is close enough. Maybe not, he said, and he went back to his shift. On day 10, one of the senior assessors, a broad-shouldered individual with deeper amber bass tones than the others, who had spoken to me perhaps 3 times in the entire assessment, appeared in the kitchen while I was washing the morning cups and said, in Galactic standard that was noticeably more formal than the others, Mr. Pillai, in your professional history, did you find the work satisfying? I thought about how to answer honestly. Some of it, I said. The bridge work mostly. There is something good about building a thing that holds weight. You can see it. People drive over it and don't think about it at all, which means it's working. He processed this for a moment. And the drainage system? He said. He had clearly read the file. The drainage system was a fight from start to finish, I said. The soil conditions were wrong. The specifications had to be revised twice. The contractor filed 2 grievances, and there was a dispute about water rights that had nothing to do with the engineering at all. It was a difficult 3 years. And yet you are not bitter about it. It drains correctly, I said. Eventually the water goes where it's supposed to go. That's what it was for. He looked at me for a moment. His luminescence did the tide amber pulse, slower than Soroveth Karas's version of the same thing, but recognizably similar. I see, he said, and he returned to the operations room, where I heard him begin what sounded like a very long conversation with someone on a remote comlink. On day 11, something shifted in the operations room. I could not tell you exactly what, because I do not speak Vithori, and the equipment was not mine to inspect. But the conversation through the wall that night was longer than usual, with pauses that had a different texture, not deliberative, but something more like the pause ease in a meeting where people are having difficulty saying what they mean. I recognized it the way you recognize a sound you've heard in many forms, on many sites, in many contractor dispute hearings. Tick silence of people confronting a problem they did not expect to have. In the morning, Soroveth Karas looked tired, which on a Vithori manifests as a dimming of the bioluminescent layer, rather than any change in posture or expression. She was about 10% dimmer than her usual operating brightness, and she moved through the kitchen with the particular deliberateness of someone who has been up longer than they intended. I made the 11 o'clock tea without being asked, and set a cup at the kitchen counter where she usually stood when she came to talk. She came in at 11:17, picked up the cup without comment, and stood there for a moment. "You heard us last night," she said. "I heard that you were talking late." "We are recalibrating our assessment framework," she said. "I see. Specifically," she paused. "Specifically, we are debating whether the anomalous readings this assessment has produced represent a genuine outlier in the host population or an error in our instrumentation. Is the instrumentation working correctly? Yes, we have checked it 4 times. So, I am the anomaly. You are." She looked at the cup. "Yes, you are the anomaly." I did not say anything to that because there did not seem to be anything useful to say. I was 58 years old. I had always been quiet. Latha had once told me early in our marriage that she had at first found my stillness unsettling, and that she had spent the first 3 months convinced I must be very angry about something all the time, because she had grown up in a house where stillness meant anger. She had eventually concluded that it did not mean anything in particular, that it was simply the way I occupied space, and she had come to find it over the years restful. I had thought about that a great deal after she was gone. "Is it a problem?" I asked, "being the anomaly?" "It complicates the assessment." "In what way?" "Our model assigns threat classifications based on arousal signatures. 0 arousal in a non-sentient organism is natural. 0 arousal in a sentient organism, in a high-stimulus environment, is intrusive. Our model does not have a category for what it means when the organism is simply not stressed." "It means the environment isn't stressful," I said, "for the organism." "Yes," she set down the cup. "That is what it means. Our model was not designed with that possibility in mind." I thought about this. 43 years, I said. And in all that time, across 19 species, no one was simply not stressed? There were cases of suppression, chemical intervention, pathological detachment. She paused. "We have considered all of them for your profile. None fit. Because I'm not suppressing anything. Because you are not suppressing anything." We stood there for a moment with that between us. "I think," I said finally, "that the environment is, in fact, not very stressful. I live here. I know where things are. I have a routine that I find satisfying. You and your colleagues are professional and courteous. No one has been difficult. The equipment is quiet. The only things that have been noticeably unusual are the assessment sequences. And those I thought about how to say this. Those feel like someone checking to see if I'll react, which makes me curious about why they're checking, more than anything else." She looked at me for a long time. "That," she said, "is a very accurate description of what we are doing." "I know," I said. "It's not a problem." She picked up the cup again, drank, set it down. "Mr. Pillai," she said, "what you have just described, that precise understanding of our methodology, combined with complete absence of arousal about being assessed, is itself an extremely high-scoring data point on our model. Why? Because the only entities who have historically shown that combination are in individuals who are either very experienced at being evaluated or very confident about the outcome. I've had a lot of performance reviews," I said. She looked at me. "Bridge contracts require them," I explained, "every 3 years. Plus the project audits and the dispute hearings." "How many dispute hearings?" 7, over 31 years. The drainage system had 3 on its own." She took a breath, that seemed for a Veth 3 to be the equivalent of sitting down heavily. "I see," she said. "And then, after a pause, did you win them?" "Most of them." I refilled her cup. The drainage system ones were complicated. The soil conditions were genuinely unclear. I consider them a draw. On day 12, the broad-shouldered senior assessor appeared in the kitchen again, this time with two coliker, a look that suggested the long, calm conversation had reached some kind of conclusion. He told me, in the measured, formal, galactic standard of someone reading from notes he had prepared, "Mr. Pillai, our division has now processed 11 full days of data. We would like to ask you some direct questions, with your consent, as a supplement to the instrumented record." "Of course," I said. "Have you, at any point in the past 11 days, felt threatened by our presence?" "No," I said. "Have you felt anxious about the outcome of the assessment?" I thought about this carefully, because I wanted to give him an honest answer. "Mildly curious about it," I said. "Not anxious. Is there a difference?" "Yes," I said. "Anxiety is when you don't know what will happen, and you mind. Curiosity is when you don't know what will happen, and you'd like to find out." He wrote this down. His two colleagues wrote this down. There was a pause in which all three of them appeared to be writing more than what I had said, which suggested they were adding annotations. "One more question," he said. "Why did you apply for this program?" I looked at the balcony, and the folding chair on it, and the small table with the 2 cups I had brought out that morning. One for me, one from habit, for someone who wasn't there. I had a good southeast-facing window, I said. It seemed like something worth sharing. They wrote that down too. I made tea. Day 12 ended quietly, the way most of my days ended, with the evening light changing through the window and the colony sounds coming up from below, and everything exactly where it was supposed to be. I do not know what they expected. Perhaps that accumulated proximity and weight of the assessment would have produced some visible change in my baseline readings, some small cracks in the apparent calm. They brought in a second dish unit from storage and set it up facing the balcony. Sorov Theris and 2 senior colleagues joined the standard team. At 11 o'clock in the morning, they ran, simultaneously, the auditory probe at elevated intensity, the proximity approach from 2 directions, the confrontational posture from 4 assessors, and this one I had not experienced before, a full bioluminescent threat display from the entire team, which meant that my living room briefly became the color of a very serious sunset. I was making tea. I looked up from the kettle, 12 Vethor in full amber red display, 2 sensor dishes trained on me, the entire room the color of fire. It was, I will admit, visually arresting. The light came from all sides at once, and had the quality of late afternoon in a forest clearing, warm and directional, and oddly still. I stood for a moment and took it in. Then I poured the water. "The water needs to be just off the boil," I said, not to anyone in particular. "If it boils too hard, it makes the tea bitter." Latha always said I rushed it. She was right. The amber red faded, not immediately, but steadily, the way a fire dies when the air goes out of it. The room cooled through orange, through gold, through the uncertain blue gold of deliberative amber, and finally settled into the soft, pale white of something the Vethor call, according to the glossary appended to their report, resolved stillness. It is the color their species produces when a threat has been reclassified as non-threatening, not because the stimulus has changed, but because the model has. Tethvel Oreth sat down on the floor. I think it was voluntary. His legs simply arranged themselves that way. He sat and looked at me, and I poured the tea, and the sensor dishes recorded everything. Soroveth Karis wrote in her tablet for a long time. I made enough cups for the room and left them on the counter, and went and sat in my chair and read until the light changed. They left on the morning of day 15, packing their equipment with the same professional efficiency they had arrived with. The apartment returned to its normal dimensions. I folded the extra chairs and put them back in the storage unit. I washed the extra cups. The second bedroom still smelled faintly of whatever the equipment used as coolant. A clean mineral smell, not unpleasant, and I opened the window for an hour, and that went away too. Soroveth Karis was the last to leave. She stood at the door with her bag over one shoulder, and she looked at me in that deliberate frontal way that indicated intention, and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Paley, for the hospitality. Come back any time," I said. It was the standard thing to say. I meant it. She paused. "The exchange guest, the one who was to come after our assessment." "Yes." The program sends whoever is next on the assignment list. It will not necessarily be a Vithori. I understand. I am not certain. She started, and then stopped, and chose a different beginning. The Cultural Integration Program assumes a relatively standard host profile, one who is somewhat more visibly responsive. The exchange guest will have received a briefing about the host based on our assessment. What will the briefing say? She was quiet for a moment. That the environment is calm, she said carefully. Exceptionally calm. Is that a problem? That, she said, depend very much on the guest. She left. I made tea. I sat on the balcony and watched the sky change. The report arrived 6 months later. As I said, 97 pages. I read it over several evenings, which is the appropriate pace for a 97-page document, tisk, and I had by then returned to the habit of reading in the evenings rather than the mornings, because I had discovered that the mornings were better for sitting on the balcony and not reading anything. The executive summary was 3 pages. The threat classification section was 11. There was an appendix dedicated entirely to the tea, not a commentary on its quality, tisk, but a formal analysis of what it meant that the host had offered a beverage under stimuli conditions, that their protocol associated with species tisk level threat, and whether this behavior should be categorized as dominance display, social bonding attempt, or a third category the appendix authors labeled unexplained comfort behavior. They had elected the third category on all 14 instances. Struck me as honest, if unsatisfying. I appreciated that they had at least tried to classify it, rather than omitting it from the record entirely. That is what you do with data you don't understand. You record it accurately, and note that you don't understand it, and you leave room for someone else to work it out later. I had in more than one engineering report over the years. It is not a comfortable thing to write, but it is the correct thing. The headline finding, if a government ministry assessment document can be said to have a headline, was that Rajan Krishnamurthy Pillai, Host Family Tier 1, Block D Unit 1408, Colony Housing Complex 7, had been assigned a Civilian Threat Gradient Index score of 9.8, which was, the document noted in measured administrative prose, the highest score ever recorded for a non-military, non-enforcement, non-emergency services individual in the 43-year history of the instrument. The runner-up, a retired naval commander who had diffused a hostage situation using a thermos flask and 17 minutes of sustained eye contact, was noted in a footnote. She was rated 8.4. The gap between 8.4 and 9, footnote observed, in what I can only describe as slightly pained scientific language, was statistically significant and as yet unexplained. There was a second document attached, which then Mosey flagged in her covering note. It was a Vithori Cultural Ministry internal memorandum dated 3 weeks after the assessment team's return, reclassifying the Human Host Family Program from Routine Cultural Exchange, Tier 2, to Sensitive Species Relations Protocol, Tier 1, which the memorandum explained required enhanced preparation, specialist briefing, and in a recommendation that appeared at the bottom of page 2, and had the particular understated quality of something written by someone who was choosing each word with great care. Optional psychological support resources for any Vithori personnel assigned to extended human household environments. I read that line twice. Then I put the document down and went to make tea. The second guest arrived 2 months after the report. Not Vithori, a young individual of the Rathali, a species I had not encountered before. 4 long arms and a complexion like polished copper and very large eyes that moved independently. Name was Sithara Vel Orath. No relation to Teth, apparently, as Vel Orath was a common designation cluster in that region, and she had received the assessment briefing. She stood in the doorway of my apartment on arrival day with her luggage, and looked at me with those independently moving stu, which gave the impression of being assessed from 2 slightly different angles simultaneously, which I found rather efficient. You are the 9.8, she said. I am Rajan, I said. Come in. I'll put the kettle on. She came in. She sat on the sofa with her forearms arranged carefully and looked around the apartment. Clean, quiet, adequately lit, a book on the side table, a small prayer lamp on the shelf that I lit on Thursday mornings, the balcony with the folding chair and the small table. The briefing said to expect a calm environment, she said. Then Mosey's office or the Vithori document? Both. She tilted her head, and both eyes tracked toward me simultaneously, which I had read was a sign of focused attention in the Rithali. The Vithori document said you offer tea. I do. I would like some. I made it. She held the cup in 2 of her 4 hands and sniffed it carefully, which I had learned was a Rithali sensory habit, rather than suspicion, and then she drank it slowly and said, "What do you do in the mornings before you make the first tea?" "I sit on the balcony," I said. "I watch the sky." She looked at the balcony. She looked at me. "Can I come?" "Of course," I said. She brought her cup. We sat. She had to arrange the folding chair differently to accommodate her arm configuration. She managed after some experiment. And we watched the sky for 37 minutes while it went through the particular sequence of colors it forms at that hour, which is different every morning, and always worth watching. She did not say anything for most of it. Neither did I. At the end she said very quietly, "The briefing was right. It is calm here." "Yes," I said. "The Vithori assessors." She turned one eye toward me while the other continued watching the sky. "Were they afraid of you?" I thought about it. "I don't think so," I said. "I think their instruments were afraid of what they couldn't measure." She considered this for a while. "That is," she said, "a very precise answer for a person who says he doesn't think much on the balcony. I've had a lot of mornings to work it out," I said. She stayed for 6 weeks. She learned to make the doll. She never got the tempering quite right, but she got it close, and she was proud of close, which is the correct attitude. She thread of my books, returning each one with a small piece of paper inside, marking a page she wanted to discuss, which I found an excellent system that I later adopted myself. She asked, near the end, if she could come back. I told her the calendar was open. The 4th exchange guest arrived the following spring. He was Vithori, a young male, barely out of what passed for adolescence in that species, soft, uncertain bioluminescence, and a name I will not try to write here, because the transliteration is genuinely unkind to both languages. He arrived with his luggage and a separate bag that turned out to contain, I discovered later, package of materials from the Cultural Ministry's newly established Human Household Preparation Program, a 16-page briefing document, a short informational recording, and a small laminated reference card. The card listed, in Vithori and Galactic Standard, several phrases. One of them was, "Please remember that a calm human is not signaling threat. Calm is simply what they look like." He stood in the doorway reading this card, and then he looked at me, and I looked at him, and I said, "Come in. I'll make tea." He tucked the card into his bag. He came in. He sat on the sofa and arranged himself, and looked around the apartment with those large lateral eyes, and after a moment, his bioluminescence, which had come in at a cautious pale gold, settled into something softer, not quite white, not quite still. Color, I would learn, of a person deciding that a situation is probably all right. I recognized it. I had learned to recognize it by then. The moment when the Vithori bioluminescence stops doing the thing it does when it is checking whether something is dangerous, and starts doing the other thing, the quieter thing. It usually happened within the first hour. The 12 assessors had never quite made it there, too busy measuring to settle. The exchange guests got there faster. This young one, standing in my living room with his card in his bag and his luggage by the door, got there in about 4 minutes, which I thought was rather good. I thought about the 12 assessors who had come before him and their 97 pages, and the appendix about the T footnote, about the naval commander, and the memorandum about the counseling resources. I thought about Tethvel Orith sitting on my kitchen floor asking about mustard seeds, and the junior assessor who had stood on my balcony for 38 minutes and written 6 inconclusive pages about what it meant. Shh. The broad-shouldered senior assessor asking about the drainage system in the tone of someone who genuinely wanted to know. I thought about Sithara and her 4 arms and her independently moving eyes, and her close but not quite tempering, and the small pieces of paper she left in my books. I thought about Latha saying I rushed the kettle, which I still did sometimes and which I was still working on. The kettle boiled. I poured. Outside, the sky was doing what it does.